And thank you for coming to my talk today. It's a pleasure that actually today is the first time we officially introduce and present this project that we are working on almost for 2 years, over 2 years now, that I call it the Cartography of Iran Online Publics. Today I will talk about a little bit of background and history and why we started looking at this project, and then give you an overview of the cartography project, and then focus on one sub-project, which is looking at the use of Twitter during the presidential election in 2013 in Iran. I'm talking about a little bit of how we used social network analysis and some computational tools and natural language processing for mapping the political landscape of Twitter in 2013 in Iran. So everything about Twitter in Iran should get back to 2009. After presidential election in 2009, people came to the streets in Tehran. They were protesting and they were looking for their votes, as they claimed it was lost. It was interesting historical moment because in June 15th, people occupied the urban spaces in Tehran. They took over the Freedom Square in Tehran, and 2 to 3 million people were marching that day. And that was the photo Ben Curtis took from Associated Press that get around the world a lot. And right after that, next day, Washington Times wrote an editorial, called it Iran's Twitter Revolution. And it was total nonsense. And I don't want to go back because all of us now admit it. No one was using Twitter at the time in Iran. And yeah, Twitter was used outside Iran by a lot of people to talking about what's going on inside Iran, but no one asked why, if Iranians use it to mobilize people in the street, why everyone is tweeting in English. And that was, it became very popular. And we always have this selective exposure, and we fell in love with the technologies that we create. And lots of corporations use these cases of social movements and civic engagement to promote their technologies, actually. And that was, I think, one of the cases. But most important, I think, what I am interested, I'm not interested in Iran's Twitter revolution. I'm interested in Iran's Twitter evolution, how it's used by people for different purposes. And I think one of the reasons that happened, that Iran's Twitter revolution case, was this empirical gap that exists. And one of the goals of the cartography project is provide the basic foundational information that can inform us and fill this gap in our understanding of the online public environments in Iran. There are some limitations and problem restrictions, especially when you are dealing with a repressive regime. It's really hard to acquire empirical data. You cannot go freely do surveys or on-ground surveys or online surveys in any form. And it's really, you should be creative in the way that you can collect reliable data. So that's one of the goals of this project. And I'll use this metaphor of cartography. It is like an unknown land. So it was like when the New World discovered, the first thing they did is start to find out how things are located in relation to each other. So that's one of the goals of this project. And we also have some methodological goals. There are new technological developments, and we don't really know which methods works best to provide this mapping of the cases. And especially when you are dealing with Persian text and data, there are more problems because there are lots of solutions developed, for example, for sentiment analysis for English, but not that many tools is out there for Persian. That was another, and still is another goal to develop these new things. And last week, Lance Bennett gave a talk here, and he was talking about the importance of not focusing on one platform, but having an inclusive perspective towards multiple platforms and looking at the ecology of social media, this new media, how different forms of them are used by people. And we believe that's very important. And it brings up this issue that you need to use mixed methods, different types of methods, qualitative and quantitative, to answering different questions about this. A little bit of background about the work that has been done in Iran. 2008, John Kelly and Bruce Ettling at Berkman Center, Harvard, they did a study of a very interesting case, and that was looking at Persian blogosphere. Iranians are known to be one of the very active blogging nations, at least from early 2000 or when the blogs start to grow in Iran. And the assumption was that most of the bloggers in Iran are liberal, progressive, young Iranian. And what Kelly and Ettling did, they looked at, crawled this Iranian blogosphere, and they did some used some machine learning techniques to classify and identify the political orientation of each blog. So looking at both content analysis and the structural links and links to the external sources to figure out whether this person is pro-reformist blogger or pro-conservative. One of the shocking findings of that study was that, in spite of our assumption, we were thinking that it's mostly liberals in the environment. It was evenly divided between conservative camps and reformists. That's the empirical gap that I'm talking about. That's that we want to just go beyond the anecdotal evidence collecting this data. Something was missed in that study, I believe, and there's no way probably to trace it back. Early on, 2005, 2006, Iranian government noticed that blogging became a very important medium for communication. So they start recruiting what they call them officers or cyber officers to write blogs. Even they write Wikipedia entries. So these people being paid to do that. And I don't know to what degree this presence is associated with that. But in this, we want to continue the work that Kelly and Ettling did to take it to the Persian Twitter, and I talk about that today. In our cartography of project, we had multiple streams. As Breyer said in 2012, I studied a project on Facebook. We looked from last year on Twitter. For a short period of time, during the presidential election in Iran, we looked at Google+, Flickr, and YouTube as well. Now we are adding new streams of research. One of the very exciting ones that I call them invisible social networks are these new messaging apps like Viber and WhatsApp, creating these new untraceable social networks. And another case is that the internet-based news agencies in Iran. We identified over 530 small news agencies, and we want to look at how different narratives are propagated in the network. Lots of them are funded by institutions associated with Revolutionary Guard in Iran. So they have an agenda, and we want to see how that works. This is the new stream. About the Facebook study, in March we put out a report here at Annenberg, which was based on our online survey in 2012. And it was mostly it was exclusively the data from inside Iran, the users who were using Facebook inside Iran. We collected some data also from Iranian who are now residing outside Iran, and we did it because we were interested to use them like a control group because we want to figure out what properties are associated with being a Facebook user inside Iran. For example, we see differences in the perception of security and privacy in that case. And we were interested to see if we compare the Iranians with other people, like for example in the US, whether there are differences. And there were, for example, Iranians tend to like each other content 4 times more than Americans. So that's part of the. And so this project is also going on, and so I don't want to talk about that. Today about the Twitter, we did some pilot tests. One of my colleagues, Alan Black, sitting back there, helped us a lot and we tapped in his expertise because he worked for 2 years on how most efficiently you can crawl data from Twitter. During the presidential election for 6 weeks, we crawled all tweets that we could crawl from the existing search API. And we also did some study on a few hashtag storms in Iran. They were very important because they were non-political cases. There were 2 cases that we studied. One was when 3 Iranian elite mountain climbers got lost in Himalayas. So Twitter users get together to mobilize resources for a rescue operation. And the other case was 5 Iranian border guards were kidnapped by an Al-Qaeda associated group in Pakistan. Again, Iranian users get on and made it a global trend to bring attention to the rescue operation for those folks. And that's very important because it's non-political, so government is not sensitive to those cases. But it is one of the cases that crowd learns how to self-organize itself. And when I was interviewing some of the people, they said that in the case of climbers, we learned how to tweak or game the Twitter algorithm to make it trend. So next time, and in the second case, we did in 5 hours, we make that a global trend. And we did some general crawling of Twitter from April to September this year to understand some of the mechanics. For the specific project that I'm talking about, the presidential election, last year we used the Twitter Zombie, as I mentioned, developed by Alan Black at Drexel University for crawling the data. We use Search API. There's a lot of discussion about streaming API benefits and Search API. I think we are advocates of Search API for good reasons. I know lots of people love a streaming API, but for the case of Iran, and it's a technical case, if you want, we can talk about it in Q&A, but I argue that's a very well responding solution. We started with some initial keywords, and that's very important because there are emerging keywords that you do not know and might bias your data set if you just keep with a set of fixed keywords. Every day we were looking what keywords are become up or what terms are used, then we add it. And because Search API allows you to go back 7 days, we could get all the data as it emerged. That's something that you cannot do with the streaming API. At the end, we were using 47 keywords and hashtags for collecting the data. And our data collection window was almost 6 weeks from mid-May until end of June, just 2 weeks after presidential election, because we wanted to see it before and after. And we did some normal data cleaning and normalization, which is required. And at the end, we had a data set of over 3 million tweets in multiple languages, from which 460,000 were in Persian only. I give you an overview of the project. So we collected the data from the keyword searches. Then we identified the language with a component that we had for language detection. We create different data sets based on different languages. We extract the data which need to be processed for social network analysis, like retweet networks, mention networks, which are known as communication networks in the Twitter. So I assume everyone knows what's a retweet network and mention network. If you use an @ handle someone's name, we call it a mention of some person, and you can create a link between 2 nodes who mention each other with a directionality. And then we did normal social network analysis to calculate different centralities of the people in the network to see who is the most influential in different communication networks. And we also run community detection, which looks at the structural relation between different users and how we can put them in same clusters. And then when we cluster these groups, we looked at the profiles to say, okay, whether this cluster represents a specific political orientation or a specific geographical location that can be identified. And that was the qualitative analysis part I had. We also did some natural language processing. My colleague and friend, Xiaoyi Ma, he's just across the street. He's at the Linguistic Data Consortium at Penn. He helped us to develop some tools for natural language processing, for sentiment analysis and topic detection. The same process, but it was only focused on Persian tweets. We didn't look at the other languages. We had the NLP engine, which we mostly use a Stanford classifier for this work. And we had a training process. We use that to identify tweets, process it, and do the statistical analysis. But for the training, we used human annotator to annotate data set, and we used it to train our natural language processing engine to get the results. So they look at the sentiment of the tweets, and what we annotated whether the topic is related to election, whether there's name of any political entity appear in the tweets, whether what's the sentiment of the tweet toward that name, if there's a name in the tweet, whether the sarcasm exists in the tweet, because there's a lot of discussion. Sarcasm is important medium for political communication in Iran. There are problems with detecting sarcasm in the literature. It's really hard to detect sarcasm. We had high precision but low recall in the detecting. When I say high precision, those tweets that we detect sarcastic, they were sarcastic, but we could not identify all tweets. And even with this, almost 18% of all tweets were detected as sarcastic. So we have over more than 1/5 of all political tweets were sarcastic based on our findings. We also look at whether we can figure out whether the content of tweet encouraging participation in election, because that was a very important debate at the time, and whether we can find out from the content of the tweet the political orientation of the text. Because Kelly and Ettling did that with the blog post, which is a larger piece of text, but we were not successful to do it in tweet, because 140 characters, you pull out all the URL, at mentions, and whatever, you get few words, and it's really hard. But sentiment analysis gave us a promising outcomes, and I will talk about that later. So we recruited 3 annotators. We were fluent. They were fluent in Persian. First, they annotated 300 tweets. Then we put them in a room, talk to each other, say, okay, figure out the differences, and come up with a way that you can more uniformly have an agreement on how you annotate. Then we gave them data sets with overlaps, and that combined our final data set, which was almost 4,000 tweets at the end. It's relatively small yet, and we hope in future we get funding, we can expand that and improve that. As I mentioned, we use Stanford classifier for most of the language processing. It's a little bit technical. We can talk about it later if you have questions. But it was interesting. We just use n-gram features. Unigrams, I mean, that if 1 word or 2 word co-occurrence or 3 word co-occurrence can predict the sentiment of tweet. We didn't have dictionaries in Persian. What does it mean? If you have a dictionary of positive and negative words, it helps you to identify whether the tweet has a negative sentiment or positive sentiment. But because we didn't have those dictionaries available, which you can easily find for English, in Persian, we could not use a dictionary-based method. So we just went with the looking at the co-occurrence of the terms in a text and whether that can predict the sentiment of the tweet. We got relatively good results. We got the accuracy of 70% on the sentiment analysis, which using with the basic feature is pretty good. OK, so looking in the data, as you see, Twitter is like many other phenomena, is a long tail person. Just 7% of the users during the 6 weeks have tweeted more than 5 times. 71% of the people who showed in our data set just tweet once during the whole 6 weeks. So we have a small group of people who are actively talking. Another interesting thing that at the beginning does not sound very interesting, but when you look at the data, is that what platforms people use to send tweets. And it shows a huge gap among the Persian tweets in use of mobile data sets. While in all language tweets, like English, Spanish, Arabic, over 35% of the tweets came from mobile platforms. In Iran, only about 15% of tweets came from mobile platforms. And it shows this difference between, a basic difference in the use of hardware. And so mobile platforms is growing up in Iran, and then it's become very interesting because last month there was a huge debate because Iranian new government wants to improve 3G and 4G networks. And then the hardliners put a lot of pressure to stop this plan and even get to the level that some clerical figures get putting out fatwas with its edicts to say that 4G and 3G is haram, so we should not develop it in the country. And I think that's why, because they're filling this gap, because they're becoming more popular and they're creating more connectivity in society, but that's something. Another interesting finding was that all the data that we collected about Iran, we had to collect both in English and Persian because lots of people, they use hashtags which are in English. For example, Iran talks now about Iran nuclear negotiation, things going on. Both those who are tweeting in Persian and English, they use hashtag Iran talks in English. And if you want to collect all discussion in Persian, you have to collect the data. So it brings a lot of English as well. And because Persian and Arabic using very similar script. For example, if you write Iran in Persian, this is the same word with same Unicode characters in English. So you will crawl a lot of tweets in Arabic as well, which have the hashtag Iran. So we got a lot of English and Arabic. 1/3 of the data set was in English. And almost very close, 27% of the data set was in Arabic. And it was very interesting that when you look at the data, mostly by hardliner, fundamentalist Twitter users in Arabic, and they were talking about the sectarian issues and regional issues about Iran and mostly curse Iran. And that's a very interesting research study. So someone look at Iran's perception among its neighboring country, and that's not very great. And the other one was that Spanish is Persian is the fourth and most used language for tweet about Iran. And Spanish was interesting. In the last 10 years, Iran built up a lot of relationship with the countries in the South America. And Ahmadinejad is always just tripping to Venezuela and all those countries. And it was interesting. It created a lot of Spanish-speaking discourse about Iran, and it was interesting for us. If you look at the temporal distribution of the tweets, it's a very simple thing that it shows the relationship between, it was in the 21st of May, the former president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, was disqualified. That was a big news. The blue at the bottom are Persian tweets, the orange is Persian and English, and the green is all languages. And you see all Twitter users reacted to that. These three pikes here are the three TV debates between presidential election. But the interesting thing here is mostly Persian users reacted to that. The spikes here is mostly created by the blue line. It was not interest of English-speaking Twitter users. So there's something like a domestic issue. But the day of election, again, everyone reacted to that. But the more interesting thing is that if you look at per hour distribution of tweets, this is the day, the result of election. At the bottom is the Persian tweets. The top in orange is English and Persian. You see a spike here in English tweets, but the day of election, Persian tweets are not that much. Iran government after 2009 learned to be proactively censoring internet. They do deep packet inspection and turtling internet beforehand. If they know this day is going to be a critical day, people might use internet to do something. They start turtling internet speed, bringing this internet speed, and do deep packet inspection to cut the circumventing routes. In October, I talked with people in Citizen Lab. They developed this circumventing tool called Siphon. I showed them the data, and they showed me their data. The connection per user were increased in that day dramatically. It means a user to be able to connect some website outside Iran should attempt 3 or 4 times. Because of the deep packet inspection, they could identify and terminate the connection. And it was interesting and surprisingly funny that if you look at the distribution of tweets, you can figure out when they are turtling internet. And that was an interesting finding for us at some point. The next thing that I think very important to look at is looking at the information diffusion network. In Twitter data, if you create the retweet network, those users who are, if I retweet your message, then there's a link between you and me will be created in the network. Retweet networks are considered as information diffusion, how a message passed to other users and propagated in the network, and that's why they are interesting for us. We created this network between the Persian and English tweets because it was also interesting for us because some of the Iranian users, they both tweet in Persian and English, so we wanted to have both lanes. And also it was interesting for us to compare the English-speaking Twitter environment and Persian-speaking. We created this and did some automatic clustering on the data. And then we picked out the people who had the highest centrality measure. When I'm talking about centrality measures, we picked 2 measures. One is in-degree centrality. It means that the people who had the most number of retweets. The other one is eigenvector centrality, that if you want to translate it to it means those users who are very well connected, and their connections are those people who are also very well connected. So those who have the best network to pass messages. So eigenvector centrality is very important for if you're looking at diffusion networks, because if you want to pass a message through the network, you have to give it to someone with high eigenvector centrality, because you pass it to his friends who are very well connected as well. And then we picked up this first 100 most important or influential users in each category, both in Persian and English, and then classified them through these 4 categories. So 3 of them are what I call them institutional elites, these, official news agencies, journalists who are working for those news agencies, or freelance journalists, and politicians like Rouhani had an account, Jalili had an account. And we had this group that we developed, we called them micro-celebrities or social media celebrities. We got this notion of micro-celebrities from Terry Sneft. And these are these ordinary Twitter users they built up their profile. Now they are very famous. They have a lot of followers. They were users. They had 70,000 followers. And the guy called Wahid Online, he was a guy, his name was Wahid. He created an online account, and now he's Wahid Online. And he's now the king of Persian Twitter. If we get a closer look to the network, the orange color is English-speaking Twitter users, and mostly residing in the West, and some people were not. The yellow is mostly Persian-speaking Twitter users. The green are mostly users from Arabic countries or having affiliation with Arabic countries but tweeting in English, like Al Arabiya English. And in this blue one, we had a lot of people from Turkey and also lots of conservative Americans. But the interesting thing is the difference. If you take a look at the difference between the orange and yellow. In orange, you can see New York Times, Christian Amanpour, Nagar Mortazavi, which is a formerly famous Iranian journalist, Associated Press, BBC World, BBC Breaking News, Al Jazeera English Live, Hassan Rouhani, Thomas Erdbrink. These are all or mostly institutional elites. But we look at the Iranian side, you see Wahid Online, Mehrzad, Sharifi 123, Siamak, Cafe. Completely different. 90% are micro celebrities. When a BBC Persian is big, that's the only news media. Some of the BBC journalists who are tweeting in Persian also have some big centralities. But the Persian Twitter is mostly ruled by micro celebrities, in contrast to the English-speaking. And it was a few months ago, Christopher Mascaro, one of our friends who studied the presidential election in the US in 2012 for his PhD, his findings was completely in contrast with my find looking at the Persian, because one of his findings was that the Twitter in English around the discourse about presidential election in the US was ruled by institutional elites. The campaign leaders, famous politicians, famous news agencies, famous journalists. And that's a very important point in this structural difference between the two camps, I believe. And part of it might be associated by Twitter being illegal in Iran. So lots of newspapers, they do not have account in it, or they do not, because it's a red line or tape, you cannot get in. And lots of journalists cannot be there. So it's a unintended positive consequence of filtering internet, because it's more user-driven, more the content is generated by people and not by institutional elite. And another interesting finding is that Mohammad Reza Aref, who was a reformist candidate running, but 2 days before election, he dropped in favor of Rouhani, who is now the president, belonged to the camp of Iranians. And if you look at the tweets, that made sense, because most of his tweets was in Persian, and he wanted to get engaged with young Iranian. Rouhani belonging to the English-speaking Twitter, because Rouhani tweet in English, and actually his account opened to talk, not with get engaged with Iranian people. His account was open to get engaged with the West, to show that I am a internationally open-minded person. In the last year, this structure a little bit changed, because when Rouhani get in Twitter, or an account which is known to be affiliated with Rouhani, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Javad Zarif, he had an official account, and some of other politicians. There is a newspaper in Tehran called Sharq. This is the only reformist newspaper living. They opened their account. Now they are very popular. So this environment might change in future if Twitter will be more tolerated in Iran. The next interesting finding, when we looked at only Persian retweet networks. So we looked at diffusion of information in just Persian word and then did some cluster analysis. Very interestingly, there was this group of very tightly clustered and completely isolated from the rest of the network. And we just said, okay, who are they? We just looked at their profiles, pull out the profiles. And this is a political party known as Mujahideen Khalq. They are not legal in Iran. They are mostly abroad. Not mostly, all of them are abroad. And they're very actively lobbying in D.C. They have an office in D.C. They have a lot of good relations with the U.S. Congress.
Formerly a terrorist organization.
Yeah, until 3 years ago, they were in the list of terrorist organizations. Now they are out of the list, but... And it is interesting, no one in Persian-speaking world is communicating or interacting with them. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the highest number of retweets, they have a lot of, because the size here again is eigenvector centrality, the connectedness. They are highly retweeted, and you see who retweet them? Yes, if one of them put a tweet out, 200 of them will retweet it. And they had bots as well. They created these sort of things that you can just click everything, it will automatically tweet and retweet. So they had a lot of bots as well. And they created these programs, small applications to tweet a lot. And if you search something related to Iran, you see them on top. So because they are getting retweeted a lot, they say a lot, they are very vociferous, but they are not influential. And that's the important difference. So before looking at how many times a message passed in the network, we have to look also who is passing that message and what's the structural importance of that user in the network. I think that's another important finding that we had. And it's interesting, they have some strategies. They are one of the early adopters of Persian Twitter. They were tweeting a lot. They are hijacking hashtags. For example, if you have a hashtag about a case an Iranian journalist is arrested, so people on Twitter create a hashtag, for example, free Mazyar Bahari or whatever. They attacked that hashtag, like immediately 200 users took over that hashtag. They start writing their own thing with the hashtag free Mazyar Bahari. And it drives people crazy. And there were incidents that people decide, okay, we have to change the hashtag. Well, they say, okay, no, this is the hashtag. We cannot change the hashtag because they took over the next one. And it was very interesting when we were observing this case. But it's important they are completely isolated, no one interacting with them in the network. And it's interesting, I don't have the visualization here. They mention a lot other people, but no one else mentioned them. So for example, they keep mentioning Hassan Rouhani, they keep mentioning even journalists and other people, but no one mentioned them. So the next part of the analysis that we use the natural language processing tool, and the most successful part was the sentiment analysis toward different name entities or name of people. From the tweets that had mention of the names and some sort of sentiment was detected in the tweet, almost 40% went towards Rouhani. And the second person with a lot of sentiment mentioned toward him was Jalili. And they were the two opposite poles of that election. It was interesting. Rouhani was the head negotiator for the nuclear case in the reform time before Ahmadinejad. Jalili was the head negotiator for the nuclear case in the Ahmadinejad time. And it was an interesting. But if you look at the results, the blue color represents positive sentiments and the red represent negative sentiments. The two reformists, they got almost 70% of the tweets that had mentioned their name were positive sentiments. Whereas if you look on the other side, the conservative camp, they almost get at least 50% negative sentiment to over 75% negative. And it shows better when you look at the ratio between positive and negative impressions. Rouhani and Aref, the two reformist candidates, like 5-to-1, 5 times more positive sentiment than negative, and they are all below 1. They have more negative impression. Why the sentiment analysis was methodologically important? Because doing the content analysis on a small text like tweet is very hard. We could not detect the political orientation of the tweets, but we were able to detect the sentiment of users toward reformists or conservatives. And through that, we were able to build up, map the political, probably which political camp they are in favor of, as Kelly and Ettling did based on the content analysis and the structural rules. And that helped us to figure out actually, in contrast to the Persian blogosphere, which was evenly divided, Persian Twitter is predominantly ruled in favor of reformist politicians. Okay, I want to conclude. So we figure out the major findings of the study. We noticed that there's a structural power structure difference between Persian Twitter and English Twitter. Persian Twitter is mostly run by macro celebrities than institutional elites. We find also, looking at the study by Bruce Ettling and John Kelly, that different social media might have different political landscapes. We have not done empirical study yet, but I interviewed some of the Twitter users and Google Plus users, They said that Google Plus is more used by conservatives because it's not completely filtered in Iran, because Google services are okay. So they have a stronger presence there. So you have to go figure out they might have a stronger presence on something like Google Plus. So that's something very important to notice. And that also says why looking at this ecology of new media important instead of just focusing on one platform. And one of our findings regarding methodological contributions was using sentiment analysis might be a very good way to map political divide and figuring out the political landscape of Twitter environment instead of content analysis. For future work, I'm thinking that doing some interviews with some of these influential Persian speaking Twitter users, and based on that, similar to what we did on Facebook, designing an online survey and circulate it on the Persian Twitter to collect some empirical evidence about the demographic of user, their preferences of behavior, and these sort of things. We want to, if we get funding, hopefully, we expand our training data set for improving our natural language processing toolkit that we have. We got very good results on some of the cases, but some of them need more and larger training data sets. And we would like to also compare the results of Kelly and Ettling's study in 2008 with the existing status of Persian blogosphere. CGCS had a report a few months ago that we are seeing a shrinkage in the size of Persian blogosphere, and people are less using blogs but going more to other social platforms. Thank you. Sure.
Could you clarify the status of Twitter in Iran? How legal is it? How do users access it? And what's the official line?
So officially, it's filtered and announced as illegal. There are court cases. I'm not sure about the Twitter, but both Facebook and Twitter, that people are getting penalties for just using Facebook. So it is illegal and have risks to be on that. To have access to Twitter, you should use circumvention tools, the filtering tools. In our Facebook study, we asked people for inside Iran which circumvention tools they used. The most popular was using virtual private networks or VPNs. And there are some evidence that lots of VPNs are also sold by government-affiliated groups. IRGC, helps to filter internet and then provide. They create the demand and then supply the demand. And then Freegate, UltraSurf, and Siphon, and Tor are four famous circumventing tools that they use. And that's why when you look at when I talk about the day of election, the turtle internet and did this deep packet inspection, they could find those connections that are circumventing, filtering, and drop them quickly. So that's the way they use it.
Also, that many governmental institutions also use VPNs, and that's how they happen to be on Twitter as well.
Yeah, and some people, there are two types of internet connections in Iran. There are two arguments. In Iran said that if you circumvent filtering, that is illegal, not using social network. And that's the argument that Iran Foreign Minister Javad Zarif used, that I'm not, because everyone said that you are doing illegal, we are. So no, I have a unfiltered connection. If you are a specific group, you can have unfiltered connection. I remember we were doing something, we got some geographical data for one of the surveys, and it was filtered. The survey was inside Facebook, but we had connections directly from Iran. And it seems that, there are some people with free internet access looking at our survey, probably security forces. So that's it. Yeah. Sure, James.
I think it was interesting when you noted that the differentiation of use of mobile platforms, when only 50% of Iranians are using mobile. How much of that is based on mobile availability, and how much is the reality that a lot of these circumvention tools you just mentioned aren't as effective on mobile?
Exactly, that's a very good question. Because a lot of users, even from among those 15%, 6 to 7% of them use web mobile to post messages to Twitter, because lots of circumvention tools are not working with the Twitter app effectively. So it is a compound, I think, case, both because mobile internet is not, 3G and 4G is not very actively used in Iran up to recently, because everyone who has mobiles, they usually use it to connect to a Wi-Fi connection, which is a plugged connection. But it's a mixture of both, and both not that many platforms, and part of it, because those who use it, half of them are using it as a mobile web instead of Twitter app or for Android or iPhone.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the issue of sarcasm, how you define that, and also how it becomes identified in a context where you're also looking at sentiment that's either positive or negative.
Okay.
Because obviously sarcasm works fundamentally by taking what could be positive or negative and actually meaning the opposite.
Yeah.
So the actual words, oh, this is terrific or great, in a sarcastic note, in fact, means something negative.
Exactly.
So could you elaborate
Okay, sure.
a little bit on that?
I think that's a very important point that you mentioned. Generally, when you look at the literature, they want to try automatic sarcasm detection. It's really hard. The result is almost close to 50% success, and 50% success means chance. If I say, okay, this is sarcastic, it's 50% chance to be right. And when we ask annotators to first run annotate 300 tweets, we just let them judge by themselves. They said sarcastic means if you'd ask by your common sense. And then when we put them in a room to talk with each other, we said, okay, what are the types of things? Say why this is sarcastic. So okay, he did a terrific job, exactly. And it was sarcastic because it came after exactly something that he says, stupid thing. So there are a lot of contextual relation and information you need. That's why you cannot detect sarcasm. Because we were not using a dictionary-based approach, as I said, for sentiment analysis, we can use the names, the dictionary of terms which have a positive or negative meaning, and their appearance in text might say, okay, good might be positive sentiment towards someone, and bad might have a negative. So because it was not available, a comprehensive dictionary, so we decided for Persian, we didn't use that. We looked at the co-occurrence of the terms and how we can create a multiple regression, actually, basically it is, to figure out whether by the human annotator this falls into the pattern of a negative and positive. So we just went through a statistical approach. And that's why I think that our findings for sarcasm was not very reliable, because those tweets, the machine identified as sarcastic. Humans also, a lot of them were sarcastic. But there was a whole bunch of tweets that a human being identified as sarcastic, but machine didn't have a way to find out that was sarcastic. But even with that, we had a huge, that's why I said that we have a high precision rate, but low recall rate. It's not very reliable, but even with that, we had about 18% sarcastic tweet detect. And it's interesting, this Khazraee, he was the champion of sarcasm. No one knows why he candidated himself for the running for election. He was almost like had some sort of dementia, sort of these crazy things. And the most sarcastic tweets was toward him, because in the debates he said something that everyone said that he is terrific. And look at the guy, and but it was a lot of sarcasm. And again, it was a lot of negative sentiments toward him. However, he's not a very conservative candidate. He was this poor man, yeah, and he created a lot of jokes at the time.
So the 18% is likely a complete underreporting of the amount
Yeah.
of sarcasm.
Yeah, but honestly, we could not figure out how we can improve it. I know if we do some more training, our annotating and training might be.
You may have mentioned it before. What was the total universe of your data? It's basically what portion of the Twitters did you use, and then also how did you get access and who collected it?
Okay, sure. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, Twitter has two mechanisms. Twitter has a set of APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, which means that one software application can connect to the Twitter source and get data, as we human beings use our web browser to get connected. Two mechanisms mostly used for collecting data. One is streaming API. So Twitter you can send queries to Twitter, and at the real time, from the tweets that are going on, It can find the tweets which are related to your query and give you if they are not going to be more than 1% of the total number of tweets. So it do a weird type of sampling of data. If you're looking, for example, at Super Bowl, you are definitely will get a sample of data. But you might get a lot of relevant data to Persian case because our data set was small. Another mechanism is that Twitter have a search index which maintain it for 7 days. You can query the search index. That was the mechanism we used. So we looked at what are the keywords and hashtags that people use to talk about Iran and Iran presidential election. And we query the search index for those hashtags, and we were able to collect those tweets up to 7 days before the time that we send the query. And we were also analyzing the tweets to see whether there's a new hashtag or keyword emerged. For example, the term monazara, which means debate, just emerged and become very active term hashtag to be used. So we added to the data collection, and we were able to trace it back to 7 days. And toward the end, we had 47 keyword and hashtags.
So it's iterative and archival.
I'm sorry, you worked on behalf of Twitter. I mean, how did you get access? Like, if it
Oh, this is public API. Everyone with some decent programming skills.
Tomorrow, and I wanted to do a similar study like this. Not that I would do it, but
yeah. So if someone has, there are tools outside. There are commercial tools that you can use, but there are also, if you have some technical skills to write programs to connect to public API, you can collect the data. And we have a friend who spent 2 years working on Twitter, actually Alan Black. He developed a tool for collecting data. Even a novice user can use it because it's a graphic user interface tool. Sure.
Two-part question. So I assume that there are lots of unexplainables in your study, but what were some of the major unexplainables, i.e. the packet turtling? And then did you look at the incumbency status of the candidates? Because I assume if you're in power, the sentiment's going to be overwhelmingly negative towards you. If you're out of power, it's going to be overwhelmingly positive. So did you look at their status?
We didn't look at the status. We just look at which political camp they are. I mean, both Rouhani and Aref were out of the game at the time. They were reformists. Rouhani was formerly head negotiator, had high position. Then he just took off his positions. He had some, consultant position, but it was not powerful. Ghalibaf was the mayor of Tehran at the time, and he still is. And he's a former commander of Revolutionary Guard. Velayati was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and now the consultant to Supreme Leader. Rezai was a former head commander of Revolutionary Guard. Jalili, commander of Revolutionary Guard, was the head negotiator of nuclear case at the time. Garazi was the king of sarcasm. At the same time in 80s, he was Minister of Telecommunication and ICT. Haddad Adel is a member of conservative group in parliament. He was head of parliament in the last cycle of the parliament. And more importantly, that was mentioned in tweets, his daughter married to Supreme Leader's son. So Aref was the vice president for Khatami, who was the reformist president in Iran. He dropped out. And as I mentioned, Rouhani was the head negotiator in reform time for nuclear case, and he was the head of Security Council in Iran at the reform time. And unexplained phenomena.
This may be the major ones, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The confidence level varies, but
Yeah, there were some issues that we were not sure about how, for example, these different communities were formed. They were very similar, but based on, and when you do this automatic clustering, you can change lots of thresholds. I mean, probably we need to play more with those thresholds to see, because they looked very similar, but they clustered to different groups. I don't know what was the basis of difference that we could identify. For example, this case, you pull them out, boom, you know, these are a specific group. Or in this case, you look at the cluster, you say, okay, there are English speaking, there are Persian speaking, there are Arabs who are speaking in English. So you can identify them, but that was something that we could not easily identify. Why? What was the basis of difference? Sure.
I know you mentioned in the future work you're looking at doing surveys to capture more demographic data. Do you have any sense of minorities within Iran, their tweeting patterns, if they're kind of different from the mainstream, like Persian, if they're using different languages, or Persian versus English, or they're
actually, we don't have that data, and we have not looked at it. And one of the complex issues, we have people with different languages preparing. They speak Azeri, they speak Kurdish, we have Arab-speaking Iranians. We also have people speaking other languages. But it's hard to say which script they use to write those languages. And in the language detection tools that we use, it's limited to a set of languages that it is trained for. Our language detection was precise to 98%. We were very happy with it. And when I said that it's precise, we looked at 10,000 tweets, and a human annotator went and checked, and 98% was precise. But we didn't have that. On Facebook, however, there are more visible, especially minority groups regarding, for example, transgender communities or LGBT communities or people of specific ethnic background. And they are more visible on Facebook. But I'm afraid that I did not have that much evidence talking about Twitter and how it is. But that's a very interesting case to look at.
So outside of looking at mentions and hashtags, did you look at, or is it possible to look at the connotation of the links that are included in tweets?
That's a very good thing. And another way that you can cluster people look at, as it was one of the techniques that Kelly and Etling used to see which external references they point to and how they are clustered based on their external references. We didn't do that, and part of it because we didn't have that many manpower to do that, but that's a very interesting way to look at it. See that what sources have been used by each community or mentioned, or what type of news and links. Yeah. But the good thing is we still have the data set. We have the data set, we can probably do that, but some of the links may not exist because ephemerality is one of the properties of Persian content on Twitter. They're shut down or just filtered or disappear. The blogger disappeared on the blog as well.
I want to know if you could talk a little bit more about how you're geographically locating tweets, particularly how you're geographically locating tweets, particularly if a certain amount of tweets are coming through circumvention tools, and then how that contributes or makes it more difficult to have a cartography of users in relation to a geographic space, when it's a geographic space that's entirely clear.
That's a very good point. When you get the tweet, it has a feature you can include in the property you get from Twitter that says geographical location. Mm-hmm. And this is the self-claimed geographical location that said, okay, where is your location? You say Philadelphia. And some of the users said, okay, middle of hell or something. That's not very reliable. The other way is that if they use a device like a mobile platform that geotag the tweet, we look at it in total in the whole 3 million data set, the big data set, not the Persian data set. It was about 4% of tweets they had geolocation tags. So it was not a easy way to use that. If all people use that, we could map them. And it was way lower. It was about 1% in Persian tweets. So it was really not helpful. But one of the ideas that we did it for the first 100 important Twitter user, that was looking at the people's profile, and based on the contextual cues, whether we can identify this person is located inside Iran or outside Iran. And interestingly, in the Persian-speaking Twitter, a very good portion of them were inside Iran.
Follow-up question. I think it's relevant. I want to know if you can speak to this. When you started your talk, you talked about how wrong the Washington Times article was and calling it an Iranian
Twitter
revolution. The Washington Times is a conservative newspaper out of D.C., and it suggests that there's a motivation into why the Washington Times might want to proclaim it as a Twitter revolution, and it suggests that there's both the role of non-Iranian actors, but also Iranian diaspora in creating certain frames of activity in Iran. So I was curious if the role of the diaspora and the discourse of the diaspora fits into your modeling of how you map users?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good question. Actually, I think Washington Times is, and lots of U.S. Congress members are affected with this community, and someone should give them this visualization, whom they're talking to. Yeah, there are certain frames that is advocated by this group. And also, I was looking at one of the publications. It came out right after this 2009 election, or just before, by Brookings. They said that Iranian problem, or how to deal, the way to Persia, title was that. And they listed up different solutions. And one of the solutions said, okay, as you said, yeah, empowering using Twitter revolution approach, Velvet revolution, these sort of things. Yeah, there are these certain frames where specific, the groups and some of the Iranian diaspora, which has a specific political orientation, are pushed into those things. And I think it's very important that MEK is actively lobbying in DC, and they are have very good connections with the.
They lobbied to get themselves off the terrorist list. It was a very good lobbying operation.
So they are, they are very important in creating those type of frames or imposing those type of frames. They were like, and it's interesting that whole Twitter discussion. It was funny because Twitter had a plan to update their servers. Someone from the Department of State sent them an email, personal note that people are using it in Iran. Can you just hold on not updating it? And Twitter put it in their website. Yeah, because of the request from the Department of State, we decided not to update it to supporting people in Tehran. Yeah, and then Hillary Clinton had mentioned that. And that was a disaster.
That was Jared Cohen, right?
Yeah.
Head of Google Ideas now.
Yeah. And then every time Iran's supreme leader is saying something about soft war, or this constellation of soft war, or this menace, social media things, he quotes Hillary Clinton. As you remember, they stopped their planned update because they wanted to use it for doing a revolution inside Iran. And actually it contributed to their narrative to repressing use of social media. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments? Ideas for improvement? Okay. Thank you.